The Orient was a source of fear, excitement, spirituality, and desire. What do I mean by fear? I'm referring to the concern that there will be an invasion by what is sometimes called the other, that is, a foreign culture, and that will result in the loss of our culture, our history, and even our very identity. The most famous book on this subject is Orientalism by Edward Said, and he argues that Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. It's an artificial construct, he argues, based on the West's patronising perceptions of and fictional creations, and it often involves seeing Arab culture as exotic, backward, uncivilised, and at times dangerous. It's been said that Napoleon Bonaparte invented Orientalism. In 1798, Napoleon set out to conquer Egypt, his Egyptian campaign, and uncover its eternal mysteries. And he took with him some 150 scientists, engineers and artists to document everything they found. And they carried out topographic surveys, studied the ancient art, its society, architecture, as well as the modern flora and fauna they found. As part of what they discovered the Rosetta Stone, which in due course enabled them to decipher ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. And in this painting by Léon Cornier, a makeshift canopy protects Napoleon. You can see Napoleon in the centre of underneath the canopy. A soldier with his back to us is briefing Napoleon, who's surrounded by soldiers and artists. And in the foreground, under the gaze of the soldier with a drum on his back, the bottom right, two Egyptian workers are carrying a polychrome sarcophagus of a mummy of the 22nd dynasty. On the left is a figure thinking about a document. He is reading, and below him there's a group studying some documents. One of the men in the group holds a stele with a scene showing you can just about make out a worship of Ptah and the figure of Ramesses II as a child. And there's a vase there with a man has his hand on it with a dog-headed lid. And these objects are actually now in the Louvre and were copied accurately by Cornier. On the right is a female water carrier, a man talking to a chained slave, and under the canopy on the right is an artist sketching the statues you can just make out of Memnon in the far distance on the right. So this painting celebrates French genius and energy as the brightest minds uncover and document the ancient secrets of Egyptian civilization. So how did this heightened interest in the Orient begin? In 1798, Napoleon launched the campaign, and the end result was a 23-volume description of Egypt, the largest published work in the world at the time. The volumes were enormous. It's about a metre high, and it was the work of 160 scholars, 2,000 artists, including 400 engravers. So why did Napoleon invest so much in such a monumental and expensive work? Well, I think politically he saw the strategic importance of Egypt, which at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire. It controlled the routes to the Far East. It was an enormous scientific achievement and cultural record, so it was a propaganda exercise that established him and France as European intellectual leaders of the Enlightenment. and it linked the French Empire, which he was building, with the greatest and longest lasting civilization known in Europe at the time, the Egyptian civilization. After Napoleon's fleet was defeated at Trafalgar in 1805, he returned to France. The scientists and artists documented everything they'd found in these volumes, which were published between 1809 and 1829. And the book created enormous public interest in the Orient, and that inspired artists through the remainder of the century. Now, there were many Orientalist artists in France. Wikipedia lists 187, but from these I've selected, in order of their birth year, Antoine-Jean Gros, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, Eugène Delacroix, Jean-Léon Gérôme, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and Henri Matisse. So let us start with Gros. This I think this is one of the most famous paintings of Napoleon's visit, painted in 1804. It shows Napoleon visiting a plague hospital, Bonaparte visiting the pest house or plague hospital in Jaffa. It was actually commissioned by Napoleon, perhaps partly to quell rumours that he'd actually ordered 50 plague victims, that is French soldiers, to be given fatal doses of opium so they wouldn't hold up his retreat. And there were rumours in France that his soldiers committed atrocities during their capture of Jaffa. In other words, this painting is propaganda. It's set in a monastery. Jaffa can be seen in the background with an enormous French flag flying over one of the towers. On the left is a man in Oriental dress handing out bread, and behind him there are two men carrying out a body on a stretcher. In the centre, Napoleon is touching the swelling under the armpit of a plague victim. And in front of him, an Arab doctor tends to another patient, incidentally, who would be, if you imagine him standing, would be enormous if he stood up. On the right is a blind man struggling to approach Napoleon. It was exhibited in 1804, in between his proclamation as emperor and his coronation. So it was clearly part of that important propaganda exercise. Napoleon is clearly being shown unafraid and tending to the plague victims. I think there's even an implication that his touch can cure them. One other painting by Gros. This is a large painting showing the 1798 Battle of the Pyramids, as it was called, which was one of the rare French triumphs in the campaign. Prints were produced of this painting, usually the central part, Napoleon on his horse, excluding many of the French officers that are shown around him. Now, Gros studied under the French neoclassical artist Jacques-Louis David, but he failed to win the Prix de Rome. He came second, but he still funded himself to travel to Italy, and he funded himself by selling portraits. And then in 1796, he had met Josephine Bonaparte on her way to Milan, and he, through that contact, became portrait artist and history painter to Napoleon. So that's how he met Napoleon. And after Napoleon's fall, he did go on to achieve many things. For example, he was made a baron in 1824, but in his own terms, he felt he never succeeded and suffered from depression and committed suicide in 1835. This is Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, and this is Grand Odalisque. Now, ironically, Ingres became the guardian of conservative art, academic art, and fought against the rise of Romanticism. But the expressive distortions in his work, particularly you can see in here the extra long back of the model, are now seen as precursors to modern art, and his work influenced Picasso and Matisse, for example. So here we see the intentionally distorted body of a concubine, or odalisque, with her small head, elongated back, reminding us of perhaps the Mannerist school of the Italian Renaissance. When it was first exhibited in 1814, Ingres was still seen as a young rebel, and the painting was criticised. One critic wrote, "Neither bones nor muscle, neither blood nor life nor relief, indeed nothing that constitutes imitation." And his work continued to be criticised until the mid-1820s, when he became seen to be the guardian of academic work. Just a reminder, this refined and meticulous painting disguises the fact that we are dealing with the slave trade. Many of the Orientalist paintings, I will show, glorify the slave trade by appealing to the sexual fantasies of the viewer. And in many cases, as here, there's only the slightest reference to the culture of the period being portrayed. The history of slavery spans many cultures and many nationalities back to ancient times, of course. This is Little Bather, this one is the Large Bather. I'm just about to show you the Little Bather. He painted these two pictures. This is the larger painting, or the Bather of Valpissant, which is the name of one of its original owners. Ingres was experimenting with the nude, and he experimented with three different prototypes. There's the nude seen from behind, the reclining figure, and in the last painting we saw he combined the two, and he also, the third was the helpless figure in distress. He also painted this one, the Little Bather Harem Interior, an Orientalist painting with a harem in the background, completely invented, of course. Now, Ingres was a master of drawing, not colour. He despised the work, for example, of the romantic Eugène Delacroix, and was despondent when his own work was poorly received. He believed that the essence of a good painting was to start with the drawing. An accurate drawing was the foundation, and colour was just something you added at the end. His paintings therefore tend to be rather static. They often don't capture any critical moment of action. But he was inspired by painting a series of female slaves, or odalisques. This is odalisque with slave. He never visited the Middle East, and if he had, he wouldn't have been allowed in a harem, so these paintings are entirely from his imagination. And this was painted in Rome, where he lived for 6 years. The odalisque was painted from a sketch he'd made years earlier, and the musician from a model who posed in his studio in Rome. He always, because of his belief that the foundation of a good painting was the drawing, he always took great care over the details and started with many detailed drawings. The architecture, mosaics, rugs, furniture and instruments would often, according to his assistants, would be repositioned many times until he was completely satisfied with them. And this painting was delivered to the owner in Paris and admired by all the critics. and he painted a second version now in the Waters Art Museum in Baltimore, and in that the back wall has been replaced by a view out into a garden, so it's a painting with a more open feeling. Another well-known painting produced much later in his life, called The Turkish Bath. You may associate Orientalism with such paintings, but remember that the nude female figure was unusual in English art. But we'll see more of the female nude when we look at Gérôme's painting. In London, they were widely found offensive, to quote one critic. Delacroix. His arch rival, the Romantic artist Delacroix. Just a reminder, I'm not giving a balanced summary of the work of these artists. I'm focusing today entirely on their Orientalist paintings. This is Delacroix's second major painting, and it's large, as you can see. It's over 4 meters high and shows the horrors of war. But there are no heroic figures and no suggestion of hope. And it was completed in 1824 for the Paris Salon. And for those reasons, it drew some criticism because of his depiction of total ruin and despair. And in fact, it was based on an actual event. 2 years previously, the Ottoman forces had killed 20,000 Greek civilians at Chios and deported another 70,000 into slavery. What Delacroix has done here is he's arranged 13 civilians who'd been rounded up for slaughter or slavery into these 2 pyramidal structures, one on the left and one on the right. On the left, there's a man looking down at 3 children hopelessly. A couple lean on each other in despair. On the right, the taller pyramid is dominated by an Ottoman soldier on a horse, and if you notice, he's the only person whose head crosses the horizon. He's about to draw his sword. You can just see his hand. He's pulling his sword out of its scabbard to, I assume, kill the 2 women pleading for their lives below, while below them an older woman looks into the distance. A mother lies dead while her child struggles for life. When it was exhibited in 1824, Delacroix was virtually unknown, and it was this painting that made his name. Another point to make is I've mentioned this painting before because it was this painting that Delacroix repainted parts of this painting after he'd seen John Constable's The Haywain in Paris in 1824. And he was so taken by Constable's coloration, the way he'd used natural colours, that he repainted parts of this painting. Ingres, of course, didn't like the painting. He said that it showed the fever and epilepsy of modern art. However, the state bought this painting for 6,000 francs. Another painting, very well known, painting by Delacroix, Death of Sardanapalus. And it tells the story of a king of Assyria, which was originally described by a Greek historian. And we see a large bed draped in red fabric, and on it the decadent king Sardanapalus watches impartially as all his possessions, including buildings, luxurious goods, horses, slaves and concubines, are all killed and destroyed according to his order. And he ordered this total destruction in the face of military defeat. And his final act was to burn himself on a pyre with all his remaining palace treasures. There are 6 concubines in this scene in various states of undress, and the one lying across the bed is, I believe, dead. One of his best known and most influential Orientalist paintings, the women of Algiers in their apartment, usually called the Women of Algiers. He painted two versions, some 15 years apart, and this is the first and best known version, which is now in the Louvre. And it inspired many artists through the 19th century, including Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin. Cézanne described Delacroix's intoxicating colour, all this luminous colour. It seems to me that it enters the eye like a glass of wine running into your gullet, and it makes you drunk straight away, to quote Cézanne. Picasso used to visit the Louvre once a month just to look at the Women of Algiers, and when his partner at the time, François Gillot, asked him how he felt about Delacroix, it's said that he said, "That bastard, he's really good." It's been praised for not eroticizing the women and the harem, and it's been compared with the artist you've just seen, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, with his Grand Odalisque, and the Turkish bath you've seen. Another artist we'll see later, Renoir, his Parisians in Algerian costume is inspired by this painting. Which takes us on to Jean-Léon Gérôme. This is the Draft Players in the Wallace collection in London. And it's a fine demonstration of Gérôme's meticulous, high-keyed manner, he was a very popular, successful artist. He made many visits to the Middle East between 1854 and 1875. And these figures are or can be identified in others of his paintings. They are Arnauts, Albanian soldiers in the service of Muhammad Ali in Egypt. The painting was, like many of his paintings, was turned into a print, which was published by Goupil, the French publisher. And some of the items you see here were items owned by the artist. The bench, for example, appears in several other of his paintings. The Slave Market. It's a well-known painting by Gérôme. It's become perhaps iconic of all of this type of 19th century Orientalist art. A man is inspecting the mouth of a slave woman as if he were dealing with a horse. And Gérôme incidentally painted a very similar scene 10 years earlier, but that was set in an ancient Roman slave market. There were so many of these idealised nude women in harems and slave markets in the Paris Salon that the artist Honoré Daumier, in this 1864 lithograph, makes fun of them. It says, "Still more Venuses this year, always Venuses," as if there were really any women built like that. The words are being put into the faces of these two women who are visiting an exhibition, the Paris Salon, I assume, and you can see behind them all of the paintings seem to be of nude women. Another painting by Gérôme called The Slave Market of 1871. He continued the theme of the slave market in a number of paintings. And you can imagine this is a group of slaves waiting to be sold. It wasn't really intended to be a realistic rendition of an actual scene, but they are romantic dreams designed to invoke passion through their eroticism, but at a comfortable remove. Gérôme was perhaps the most important and influential Orientalist artist in France in the 19th century, and he painted with precision highly realistic faces, bodies and buildings, and his exotic erotic subjects were often slave girls and harems as he imagined them. Incidentally, slavery and slave markets were still present in Egypt in the 1870s, and Gérôme may have witnessed them, but his portrayal of the wretchedness of the waiting slaves waiting to be sold is made sensual, and by, for example, the nude body of one of the women. So this allowed the artist and the viewer to, but at the same time, condemn the savage slave trade, but also fantasize about the sexual possibilities. Another painting by Gérôme, Pool in a Harem. He did make numerous visits to the Orient, but of course never visited a harem. That wouldn't have been allowed. He visited Egypt, Turkey, Syria, Palestine, and the Sinai. And he continually depicts scenes from the life of the Muslim world, and got a reputation as an ethnographic artist, which he was very proud of. In other words, an artist who was seen in Paris to be representing an accurate depiction of what life was like. Of course, it wasn't. It's the precision with which he paints and draws. The costumes are accurate, as is the architecture. And this painting, which is now in St. Petersburg in the Hermitage, we see a Turkish bath in a harem, and in the centre, lit through a window in the ceiling, we see two white women and a dark-skinned slave, and by the pool, smaller figures. And with almost pedantic care, Gérôme has painted the figures and the details of the setting, the smooth surface of the marble floor, the coloured tiles, the furniture, the rugs. It's realistic and classicising in technique, and is often described as academic realism. Another well-known painter, painting, The Snake Charmer, a very well-known painting by Gérôme, which was in fact used as the cover of Edward Said's book Orientalism, indicating, I think, what Said saw in this painting, a completely artificial representation of what the Orient was like. Cafe House, Cairo, casting bullets. Two mercenaries are casting bullets, as you can see on the left, and a third seated behind them seems to be inspecting one. Others, one is dancing, a man and a woman are talking. Again, Gérôme's meticulous painting renders the scene convincing. He did travel to Egypt many times and made sketches, and this may be based on people and costumes and interiors that he saw when he was in Egypt. And he's waited until he came back to Paris and brought all these ingredients together for a scene which could be regarded as, I don't know, like a novel, a historical fiction. The next painting, Bonaparte before the Sphinx, is interesting. It's now in the Hearst Castle in California, painted in 1886, so a long time, over 80 years after Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, and it shows Napoleon on his own, contemplating the enigmatic Sphinx with his army, you can see in the far distance. When it was exhibited, the title was Oedipus, that referred to the legend that all travellers on the road to Thebes must first solve a riddle posed by the Sphinx or die. And the classic riddle is, what is it that has a voice and walks on 4 legs in the morning, on 2 at noon, and on 3 in the evening? And it was Oedipus that answered correctly that it was a man who as a child crawls on 4, as an adult walks on 2 legs, and in old age uses a stick as a 3rd leg. Now, the other part of the story of Oedipus, it was prophesied before he was born that the child would marry his own mother and kill his father. And as a result, his father cast the baby Oedipus into the desert to die, but he actually avoided this fate. He was taken by a shepherd and brought up. He went on to conquer Thebes after passing the Sphinx and answering the riddle, and married the recently widowed queen of Thebes, Jocasta, who, unknown to him, was his mother. And according to the story, discovering she'd married her own son, she hanged herself, and Oedipus took 2 pins from her dress and blinded himself. So this painting, therefore, is about fate and destiny, symbolised by the Sphinx and the story of Oedipus. It was well reviewed by the New York Times, describing it as one of his finest works, and it was purchased by the billionaire William Randolph Hearst in 1898, and it's still on display in his Californian mansion. One more by Gérôme, 1885, so a late work, The Great Pool of Bursa. It's again, it's painting naked women in a public bath, this time in Bursa, which is in Turkey, exhibited at the 1885 Salon, now in private collection. But by the end of his life, Gérôme felt a man out of his time. In 1903, which is the year before he died, he wrote, "At that time, Paris had nothing to do with the Paris of today." He's talking about his first meeting with Charles Jalabert in 1840. So at that time in 1840, Paris had nothing to do with the Paris of today. No railways, no bicycles, no cars. We were less agitated, and certain districts, among others the one we lived in, and which was called the Latin Quarter, had a provincial aspect in their calm and tranquility. Now everything is changed. We no longer walk, we run like crazy. If we're not crushed during the day, we have a good chance of being murdered at night. It is charming. We have witnessed the end of the world. We are witnessing the dawn of a new one, which lacks the picturesque and above all serenity. The day is not far off when through our customs, our ways of being, our love of the dollar, we will no longer be French, neither in spirit nor in heart. Horrible to think of. We will be Americans. And that's a quote of Jean-Léon Gérôme in 1903. Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Parisians in Algerian Costume or Harem. And although this purports to show a harem, it's actually a room in Paris. He had not yet visited North Africa, so his knowledge of the culture and furnishings are all based on Delacroix's Woman of Algiers, which we saw just now. It's an early Renoir, showing his warmer palette, beginnings of his impressionist style, and a move towards fresh colours, dramatic expression, and loose brushwork. The red-headed woman in the centre is looking in a mirror held by the woman on the right, after having her makeup applied by the woman on the left, who's distracted by the woman in the background. It's a good example of how artists use the public imagination of the Orient to create a central image of, in fact, what some Parisian women with little basis, if any, in the life in the Middle East. Another Renoir, Odalisque, of 1870. And again, it was remarked at the time, this painting as well refers back to Delacroix's Women of Algiers. It was renowned at the time for the quality of its painting, and when it was exhibited by Renoir, this painting was actually called not Odalisque but Woman of Algiers. So everybody was aware of the fact that he was referencing Delacroix's painting. It's also been compared with Ingres' Odalisque with Slave, the painting we saw, if you remember, with the lounging naked woman with a slave playing a musical instrument we saw earlier. This painting in 1870 was praised by many when it was exhibited, but disliked by others. Henri Matisse, and I've jumped forward to 1923, partly to show that the inspiration of the Orient continued into the 20th century. It was still a popular subject. Well, it was a very popular subject for artists in the 19th century, and Matisse here modernizes the subject. He did visit Morocco in 1912, and that trip, which resulted in sketches, inspired this painting. The model, of course, is French. It's Henriette Delacroix, who sat for him for many paintings between 1920 and 1927. He explained at the time, I do odalisques in order to do nudes. But how does one do a nude without being artificial? And then I do them because I know they exist. I was in Morocco. I have seen them. Now, just to pick that apart a bit, the word odalisque is from the Turkish word odalik, which can mean a chambermaid or a female harem slave. And of course, Matisse would not have been allowed in a harem. So perhaps when he says, I have seen them, he's referring to the chambermaid that he saw. In other words, the wider interpretation of the word. He did build up a collection of these semi-oriental furnishings, fabrics, mirrors and screens, and he used them to furnish his studio to create this semi-oriental atmosphere. Finally, Yellow Odalisque, 1937, continues Matisse's modernising of the odalisque. It's no longer a Turkish odalisque, but it's a modern European woman. He does include a small Algerian painted table, which was part of his personal collection, as was the French pewter jug you see on the table, which was made in the late 1700s. He came to fame, I guess, about 1905, and he partly became well known then because of a public scandal over the challenging appearance of his work, particularly the starkness of the colour and the flatness of his work. His work evolved over his long life, but his essential method was to distill his emotional response to a given person or landscape or still life into bright colours and flowing decorative lines, as you see here. and the flatness of the picture and the dominance of the decorative patterns is in danger of overwhelming the subject. So there's a balance, but his draftsmanship, compositional skill and hue and tonal balance enables him to combine these flat decorative patterns with the subject matter themselves to keep in balance what is a unique modern view of a very old subject. I focused on French artists, but of course there are other artists across Europe that produced Orientalist themes. The themes continued into the 20th century. There's artists like Wassily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Oskar Kokoschka and Auguste Mack. But today I've been concentrating on the French Orientalist tradition. So thank you for your attention, and I hope to have another talk prepared soon for your interest. So thank you for your time, and goodbye for now.